Hello, everyone. This lecture will overview the spread of revolutions after the American Revolution, but also the events that will take place in the United States as it emerges as a new republic soon after the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, the ideas of it will spread across the world, back to Europe, to the Caribbean, to Latin America, and in one sense, the cries of liberty, equality will bring hope and aspirations to many peoples across the world, but it will also lead to conflict and chaos. And first, we will turn to France as an example of where this revolution will spread to. In France, as news of the American Revolution reaches there, on one hand, it's far removed. It's across the ocean, perhaps a very different place from what France is under the absolute monarchy. But even as the US Constitution is being formed, revolution breaks out in France. Under the French monarchy, it's an absolute monarchy in which King Louis rules over millions of souls. With the threat of famine, but also financial crisis, the French government ultimately is in crisis too. And this, in part, leads to the creation of a new National Assembly that declares itself now the representative of the French people. And as time goes on, this French Revolution will grow more radical and radical. Another place where revolution is going to break out is in Haiti. It's a colony dubbed Saint-Domingue under the French, and it's a slave colony. The vast majority of people that live in Saint-Domingue are slaves under the plantation order. Yet, with the events of the French Revolution, a slave revolt will break out in Haiti as well too. What's interesting, though, is that as the French Revolution becomes more and more radical, there will be an attempt by its neighboring monarchies like Prussia and Austria to try and suppress it for their own gain, but also to maintain the institution of monarchy as well too. In the process, the French king, his family is executed. Much of the nobility of France is killed as well too, and will flee abroad. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, this new National Assembly will declare France a republic and will mobilize the French people into massive armies that will break apart much of Europe. And in the midst of this conflict, there will emerge a French general. His name is Napoleon, who will seize control of this French republic and crown himself emperor, not just simply of France, but over much of Europe. The French armies will be successful on the battlefield, defeating many of the forces of Europe around them. Yet, rather than bring about a republic, the French establish a new empire for themselves. In the midst of this Napoleonic era, as Haiti has risen up in revolt, and as France is expanding across Europe, again, it is Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy that you see there in the top right, that will seize control of France. And he decides as well, too, to send his forces not just simply across Europe, but to try and retake Haiti as well, and to place it once again under French rule. The Haitians will resist successfully. And in the midst of this conflict between the Haitians and the French, Napoleon decides to give up his dreams of establishing a North American French empire and sells the Louisiana Territory, which the French had regained recently, to the Americans, doubling the size of the American Republic. In the case for Napoleon, he gets much needed cash. In the case of the Americans, they gain legal recognition and, in their minds, sovereignty over the Western territories, all the way across the Mississippi River and even farther beyond. Yet for Haiti, although they are successful in defeating Napoleon's forces, rather than remaining a republic under its leader Toussaint Louverture, in the midst of the conflict, Haiti as well too will see the rise of a strongman, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who will declare Haiti as well a monarchy under himself. And so it's quite surprising that both in the French Revolution, or I wouldn't say surprising, but notable, that in both the French and Haitian revolutions, we see the rise of new monarchies, new autocracies, rather than the adoption of a republican form of government, which is what many of the French and very likely Haitian revolutionaries intended when they first started their revolts. One thing is notable too is that as Napoleon is carving himself an empire across Europe, he conquers Spain in Europe as well, and this leads to a crisis across the Spanish Empire in the Americas. For some, the Spanish colonists will remain loyal to the Spanish king now in exile. For others, they'll swear their loyalty to the new pretender to the crown, Napoleon's brother, who's put himself now as the new king of Spain. But others will take this opportunity as the Spanish Empire is in crisis to perhaps follow the example of the United States to declare their own republics in which they can govern themselves that will have some challenges as well too. What I do want you guys to know is that over a 30-year period from 1800 to 1830, that there will be a series of uprisings across the Spanish Empire that in the end will lead to the collapse of the Spanish Empire and the establishment of independent republics across the Americas. Lots of interesting things I could say here, but again, I'm trying to keep this lecture short. What's interesting is even as the rest of the world is gripped by revolution in Europe, in the Caribbean, and across much of the Americas, the United States establishes itself its own rather stable form of government under the U.S. Constitution. And with the formation of the Constitution and under the presidency of George Washington, by and large, the United States continues to grow and prosper. And yet, even in the midst of this success, there are emerging tensions that are going to lead to the creation of political parties. Thomas Jefferson, although he's part of George Washington's government, is deeply disturbed by what he sees as the trends towards a strong national government, towards finance and commerce, compared to his vision of a more loosely based, democratic, and agricultural society that he envisions for Americans. And he becomes, in practice, the head of a new political party, the Democratic Republicans. That's the first political party that forms in the United States. And so when by the time of the year 1800, when George Washington has already stood down as president, his vice president, John Adams, has been elected as our second U.S. president. But the time of the year 1800, even as a revolution is taking place across the world, knowledge of these revolutions breaking out, Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans think that the United States should support these revolutionaries and their aspirations for liberty and equality. But there's a second political party that comes under formation under John Adams, which are known as the Federalists, that envision the United States as perhaps a stable federal government, as their name might imply. On one hand, certainly supporting and cheering on revolutionaries in other parts of the world, but at the same time remaining neutral and focusing on perhaps building the republic here in the United States rather than building it abroad. So these two political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, one led by Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans led by Jefferson, and one led by John Adams, the Federalists, are going to go head to head in the election of 1800. And this is, I will argue, the first competitive election that takes place in the United States. And it's quite a raucous one. Both sides will try to highlight their principles and what they stand for, but at the same time, they'll attack their political opponents as well, too. So if you see this pamphlet here on the right, in which Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans are attacking their opponents and accusing the current president at the time, Mr. Adams, as a hitherto to be one continued tempest of malignant actions, a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness or sensibility of a woman. Quite a scurrilous, quite a direct attack there on Mr. Adams. In response, the Federalists will attack Thomas Jefferson as perhaps being too revolutionary, as ultimately threatening the republic and ultimately an unchristian man who writes aghast the truths of God's words, who makes not even a profession of Christianity without the sanctuary and without so much as a decent external respect for the faith and worship of Christians. One of the ideas that's emerging with the French Revolution is this radical secularism. The French revolutionaries not only attack the monarchy and the old feudal order, but they also attack Christianity and the church as well too. This debate over faith and religion, again, the United States has had a clear separation of faith and state. Yet at the same time, there are concerns that the radicalism of the French Revolution might spread to the United States as well too. Uh, while a contentious election, as both sides go head to head, it's going to be Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans that win. And here's something that importantly happens during the, the aftermath of the election of 1800 is that we see the first peaceful transition of political power take place in the American Republic, in which the Federalists and John Adams relinquished their control of the government to Thomas Jefferson, to their political opponents, and to an opposite party peacefully. And when this is done in the aftermath, Thomas Jefferson encourages his fellow countrymen to bury the hatchet, which is an American expression to suggest, let's put things behind us, declaring that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, we are all Americans. Now that the election is over, let's unite under common cause. Of course, Jefferson would say that since he won, but I think credit should be given to John Adams and his Federalists. They accept that they have lost, and they hand the reins of government over to Jefferson. Just as a reminder as well, too, when Jefferson takes control of this national American government as its elected president, again, he's the executive. He's only one branch of government who executes and enforces the laws. And by this time, the White House, which you see there on the center, has been constructed. Or I should say, a portion of the White House, as we know today, has been constructed. Although he is the executive and leader of government, is Congress. Again, where Congress is held is the building that you see there on the left. Is Congress, again, the legislative branch that runs the government as well too. So it's not just simply that Jefferson won the presidency, but his political party won a majority in Congress. So now they can pass legislation, have it enforced by the president for it to come into effect. Of course, there's also the Supreme Court as well too that you see there on the right. This federal government has come into power under Jefferson, but it's the Supreme Court that plays an important role too. For Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans, they envision the United States being a country of small farmers. Yeoman farmers is a term for them. These small farmers that have their own plot of lands, that run their own small farms, their own small businesses, relatively equal to one another and independent from perhaps the pressures of an employer or of their neighbors. This is this idea of republicanism that Jefferson supports. And he sees the United States as part of a larger trade network in which the Americans will produce agricultural goods, trade them for manufactured goods in other parts of the world, places and luxury goods, whether it's from Europe or whether it's from Asia, and living perhaps a modest and humble way of life. We can see the Louisiana Purchase there that we mentioned earlier, that under Jefferson, the United States will purchase from Napoleon during this era of revolution, doubling the size of the United States. And for Jefferson, this is crucial to acquire because this is the territory where all those small farmers will settle and establish themselves and create this great egalitarian republic that he has in mind. One thing to note as well too is in the aftermath of the election of 1800, something important is done by the U.S. Supreme Court. It establishes what's called judicial review. That's the bottom bullet point that you see there. In the aftermath of Jefferson's election to office, the Federalists will try to appoint as many federal judges as they can before their party, the Federalists, leave. And what happens is, as Thomas Jefferson and his administration, particularly his Secretary of State, Madison, James Madison, the guy who writes the U.S. Constitution, as Jefferson and Madison assume the White House, but James Madison ultimately assumes his office as Secretary of State. There's a series of letters there of federal appointments for judges that are still sealed are ready to be mailed out to appoint new judges across the federal court system in the United States that are there, but are left unsent. One of the expected recipients, a man called Marbury, decides ultimately to take the Secretary of State, to take in effect the administration to court, arguing that his appointment as a judge should still take place. The letter has already been signed and sealed. It's ready to be, it just needs to be mailed out to be delivered to him for him to be appointed as a federal judge. And under the laws at the time, technically this is correct. Technically, this is correct, is that Thomas Jefferson, and the Jefferson administration would have a responsibility under the Judiciary Acts ultimately to issue out these appointments of judges to the recipients and that they become federal judges, even though it was from the prior administration. However, what's interesting is that the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, he's the guy that you see there on the right, ultimately declares that these laws compelling the president, compelling the executive branch to mail out these appointments are an overstep of judicial boundary. In fact, this is limiting the power of the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall says, you know what? In fact, these laws that were passed, enabling the Supreme Court to compel the president to do something, these laws are actually unconstitutional and are an overstep of power of the Supreme Court. And so therefore, we're going to ignore them. This is the ruling of Marbury versus Madison. In that second to last bullet point that you see there in bold. So why is this important? Well, on one hand, it restricts the power of the Supreme Court, but most importantly, it establishes the principle that the U.S. Supreme Court can decide what laws in the United States are constitutional or unconstitutional. And Jefferson recognizes this as well, too, but decides to sort of look the other way. As long as it sort of limits the power of the Supreme Court in his term as president, he's fine with it. Yet, this is an important principle. With the ruling of Marbury versus Madison, this is made, it has established the precedent, it has established the first ruling that will be passed on for more than 200 years now, that the U.S. Supreme Court has the right to decide what laws are unconstitutional or constitutional. And this is not in the U.S. Constitution, but nevertheless, this is a principle that the U.S. Supreme Court has adopted, and through now precedent through established rulings has maintained for the past 200 years. And many things I could say here, but I'm giving you guys a short lecture today.